Fort Bragg, 1968. A group of Green Berets receives a briefing before deploying to Vietnam. An intelligence officer utters a phrase that will be etched into the memory of each of these fighters for the rest of their lives. He says, "If you find yourselves working with the Australians, never, do you hear me, never look inside their rucksacks, and don't ask what's inside." The room is silent. Someone chuckles nervously, deciding it's a joke, but the officer's face remains stone. It wasn't a joke. It was a warning about men whom the U.S. Army officially called allies, but unofficially, those about whom it is better not to know too much. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment, known as the SASR, was doing things in the Vietnamese jungles that the Pentagon preferred not to record in reports. Their methods worked. They worked so well that the American command faced an unsolvable dilemma: how to explain that a handful of Australians were achieving results that entire battalions of Marines could not. But this was only the tip of the iceberg, hidden beneath the murky waters of the official history of the Vietnam War. To understand why Green Berets were forbidden from looking into Australian packs, one must first understand where these men came from. The Australian SASR was not created in the American image. It grew out of a completely different military tradition, a tradition rooting back to World War II and even deeper, into the colonial bush wars where white settlers learned to survive and hunt from indigenous Australians. The regiment was officially formed in 1957, but its real lineage begins with the Z Special Unit and M Special Unit, which operated against the Japanese in the jungles of New Guinea and on the Pacific Islands. These men did not know what air support or artillery fire meant. They worked in small groups, went into the jungle for weeks, ate what they found, and destroyed the enemy in ways that no one was in a hurry to describe in official dispatches. By the time Australia sent its first units to Vietnam in 1962, the SASR already had nearly 2 decades of tropical jungle warfare experience. The Americans, by contrast, were preparing for war in Europe, for tank battles, for a nuclear standoff with the Soviets. The jungles of Southeast Asia came as a shock to them, one for which no training program had prepared them. And this is where the story begins that the Pentagon would have preferred to bury forever in secret archives. The first clashes between American and Australian methods occurred in 1966, when the Australian task force established its base at Nui Dat, Phuc Tuy province. American advisors, accustomed to the search and destroy doctrine with massive use of firepower, were bewildered by what they saw. The Australians didn't call in airstrikes on every suspicious bush. They didn't comb the jungle in noisy columns. They simply vanished into the green hell in small groups of 4 or 5 men and returned a week or 10 days later, and then results began to appear. The Viet Cong in Phuc Tuy province started calling the Australians Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle. This name was not a compliment. It was an expression of primal terror before something that cannot be seen, cannot be heard, but invariably finds you and destroys you. American officers requested statistics. The numbers they received were mind-boggling. The average American infantry battalion in Vietnam expended about 50,000 rounds of ammunition for one confirmed enemy kill. That is not a typo, 50,000. The doctrine of suppressive fire demanded flooding the jungle with lead at the slightest suspicion of enemy presence. Helicopters, artillery, aviation, everything worked to create a death zone in which, theoretically, no one could survive. Australian SASR patrols expended an average of fewer than 100 rounds per enemy killed, sometimes significantly less. There were recorded cases where a 5-man Australian team eliminated up to 12 Viet Cong during a 10-day raid, expending fewer than 50 rounds for the entire group. The Pentagon sent analysts to figure out how this was possible. What they discovered caused some of them to submit requests for transfer. The first thing that shocked American observers was the Australian concept of movement in the jungle. Americans were taught to move fast, create security perimeters, and maintain constant radio contact with the base. The Australians moved at a speed of 100 to 200 meters per hour, not per minute, per hour. Every step was calculated. Every branch that needed to be moved was moved so that it wouldn't sway when released. Every leaf a foot stepped on was checked for dryness. A dry leaf crunches. A patrol of 5 men moved in such a way that an observer standing 10 meters away might not notice their passing. This required superhuman discipline and patience. It required a complete rethinking of what it means to be a soldier. But slow movement was only the beginning. The real shock lay ahead for the Americans. The Australians used trackers, scouts from among indigenous Australians who possessed skills that seemed supernatural to the Americans. These men could determine how many people had walked a path, how long ago it was, whether they were carrying loads, whether there were wounded among them, simply by barely visible marks on the ground and vegetation. But the indigenous trackers didn't just track the enemy. They taught white Australians to see the jungle with different eyes. Not as a hostile environment to be conquered, but as an ally that can hide, feed, and point the way to prey. The prey, in this case, was people. An American Green Beret who spent a month with an Australian patrol would later write in his diary, "They hunt men the way you hunt deer. No, worse. They hunt men the way you hunt a dangerous beast that can kill the hunter, with patience, with respect for the prey, and with absolute ruthlessness at the moment of contact." This diary was never published. The veteran's family handed it over to a military historian in 1993 on the condition that the author's name not be revealed. But even the skills of tracking and silent movement did not explain the main thing, the fear that the Australians instilled in the hearts of the Viet Cong. For that, one had to look into those very backpacks the intelligence officer at Fort Bragg had warned about. The Australians practiced what they themselves called psychological operations. The American Army also had psychological operations units. They dropped leaflets urging surrender, broadcast propaganda via loudspeakers. The Australian approach was different, radically different. When an SASR patrol destroyed a Viet Cong group in an ambush, they didn't just take documents and weapons. They left a message for those who would find the bodies. Sometimes it was playing cards, the ace of spades, the symbol of death. Sometimes something far more macabre. Declassified Australian documents mention the practice of, quote, 12. After a successful ambush, enemy bodies were arranged in a specific way. Weapons were stuck into the ground. A scene was created that was meant to tell the finders, ghosts were here, and they will return. American officers who learned of such methods reacted differently. Some were horrified and demanded an end to such practices. They were politely explained that Australian units did not report to American command. Others, and there were quite a few, wanted to know more. They wanted to learn. It was for these latter ones that the warning about the backpacks existed, because in the backpacks sometimes lay evidence, items that could not be explained without admitting that the Australians were waging war by rules not written in any manual. There were rumors of trophies, of souvenirs being taken home, of things that belonged to people who had ceased to exist in the jungles of Phuc Tuy province. The Pentagon knew. The Pentagon stayed silent, because the results spoke for themselves. By 1969, Phuc Tuy province, which the Australians controlled with a force of roughly 3,000 men, was one of the quietest regions in South Vietnam. Viet Cong cadres avoided this province. Guerrilla activity dropped to a minimum. The local population, tired of war, accepted the Australian presence as the lesser of two evils. Americans controlled provinces with far greater forces, tens of thousands of soldiers, tanks, aviation, unlimited resources. And in those provinces, the war did not subside for a single day. Ambushes on convoys, shelling of bases, terrorist acts. The jungle swarmed with an enemy that seemed elusive and indestructible. The difference in approaches was obvious to anyone who wanted to see. But to admit this difference officially meant admitting that American military doctrine was not working. That billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of soldiers could not achieve what a handful of Australians with knives and patience could. This was politically impossible. The story of a sergeant, let's call him David Mackenzie, though that is not his real name, illustrates the chasm between the two military cultures. Mackenzie was a veteran of the Korean War, an experienced scout, one of the best in his Green Beret unit. In 1967, he was attached to an Australian patrol for an exchange of experience. For the first 3 days, he was sure the Australians were leading him into a trap. They moved too slowly, too quietly, too strangely. He didn't understand their signals. He didn't understand why they would stop and listen to the jungle for 20 minutes at a time. He didn't understand why the patrol leader might cancel the entire operation because birds half a kilometer ahead were behaving quote _13 _. On the fourth day, the patrol found a track. The Australian tracker, an older man with a face carved by wrinkles, squatted down and studied the flattened grass and barely visible prints for 10 minutes. Then he held up 3 fingers, 3 people. Then he pointed at the sun and moved his hand about 30 degrees. 3 hours ago. Then he shook his head and pointed to his leg. One of the 3 is limping. Mackenzie didn't believe it. It was impossible to determine such details from tracks he couldn't even see. The patrol moved along the trail. 6 hours later, they caught up with 3 Viet Cong resting in a small hollow. One of them was indeed limping. He had a bandage on his right ankle. What happened next, Mackenzie would remember for the rest of his life. There were no shouts of quote 14. There were no warning shots. The Australians opened fire from ambush at a distance of about 20 meters. Each fired at a pre-assigned target. Each burst was short, 3 or 4 rounds. In 4 seconds, it was all over. Mackenzie had been trained in different tactics: capture prisoners for interrogation, warning before opening fire, if the situation permits, attempt to gain information. The Australians didn't take a single prisoner during his entire attachment. When he asked the patrol commander why, the answer was simple: prisoners need guarding. Prisoners make noise. Prisoners slow down movement. We don't have the resources for prisoners. It was the logic of a predator, not a soldier. But the heaviest impression on Mackenzie was not the clash itself, but what happened after. The Australians methodically searched the bodies. They took documents, maps, anything of intelligence value. And then one of them took out a knife and started slicing the soles off the Viet Cong sandals. Mackenzie asked why. It was explained to him. The Viet Cong wore sandals made from car tires. The tread of these sandals left a distinctive track. The Australians collected soles from every destroyed enemy. Then the trackers studied these soles, memorizing the pattern. If a similar track was found somewhere in the jungle, they knew that this specific individual was still alive and operating in their area of responsibility. It was a system of total control. An individual hunt for every enemy in the zone of operations. Not a massive sweep, not carpet bombing, but a personal hunt where every victim had a dossier made of rubber soles. Mackenzie realized he was looking at the war of the future, and that this war frightened him more than any enemy. Relations between American and Australian units were complex. Officially, allied and friendly. Unofficially, full of tension, misunderstanding, and hidden rivalry. Americans considered the Australians primitive. They saw small patrols without heavy weaponry, without constant contact with air support, without the technological might that was the pride of the American war machine. They saw fighters in worn uniforms with obsolete, by their standards, rifles, who were in no hurry to call in helicopters at the first sign of danger. Australians considered the Americans noisy amateurs. They saw huge columns of machinery that could be heard for kilometers. They saw soldiers smoking on patrol, talking in full voice, leaving behind trash by which their route could be tracked. They saw tactics that relied on technological superiority rather than skill. Both sides were right, and both were wrong. But the casualty numbers didn't lie. Throughout the entire Vietnam War, the Australian SASR lost fewer than 20 men in combat action. The exact figure is still classified. Australians do not like publicity in such matters. According to unofficial data, about 15 men over 10 years of operations. At the same time, the confirmed count of destroyed enemies is measured in the hundreds. Some sources cite a figure of over 500. The loss ratio, approximately 1 to 30 or even 1 to 50. For comparison, American Special Forces units operating in the same conditions suffered losses 5 to 10 times higher with comparable results. And regular infantry lost almost as many killed and wounded as they inflicted on the enemy. The Pentagon knew these numbers. Intelligence agencies analyzed these numbers, but not a single public report acknowledging Australian superiority ever appeared. Was this statistic solely the result of skill? Or was there an element present that is not customarily spoken of? The Australians did not take prisoners. This was an unspoken but well-known fact. American officers trying to obtain captured Viet Cong from Australian patrols for interrogation invariably received the same answer. The contact was too fleeting. No survivors remained. But the laws of statistics are inexorable. In tens, hundreds of combat contacts, some percentage of opponents must survive, wounded, surrendering, caught unawares without weapons in hand. American statistics for Vietnam show approximately 1 prisoner for every 15 to 20 destroyed enemies. Australian statistics show almost 0. Either the Australians were incredibly unlucky in capturing prisoners, or there were not supposed to be any prisoners. A lieutenant commander from U.S. Naval Intelligence, whose name is still classified, conducted an unofficial investigation into Australian methods in 1968. His report was not included in any official publication. A copy, allegedly leaked 20 years later, contained the following observations. Quote 16. Further in the report. Quote 17. And finally, quote 18. Undesirable political consequences. That is the diplomatic term for war crimes. But were they crimes? Or was it simply war being waged by different rules? The Geneva Conventions require humane treatment of prisoners. They forbid finishing off the wounded who have ceased resistance. They prescribe certain norms for handling the bodies of fallen enemies. All warring parties in Vietnam violated these norms. Americans, when they destroyed villages in _quote_19_South Vietnamese, when they tortured suspects in the _20_ program. Viet Cong, when they executed captured officials and their families. The Australians just did it quieter, more efficiently, and with fewer witnesses. There is documentary evidence, testimony of an Australian veteran given under oath in 1992 as part of a closed hearing on a case that never went to trial. The veteran, suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, described an episode that occurred in 1969. His patrol captured a Viet Cong courier, a young man, no older than 20, who was carrying documents between two units. The courier was wounded in the leg and could not move on his own. The documents were seized and had high intelligence value. By all rules, the courier should have been evacuated for interrogation. He could know names, safe houses, routes. He was a valuable source of information. The patrol commander assessed the situation. To the extraction point, 8 kilometers through jungle controlled by the enemy. Carrying a wounded man on a stretcher. Noisy, slow, dangerous. Calling a helicopter meant revealing the patrol's position deep in enemy territory. The decision was made within a minute. The veteran did not describe exactly what happened next. He said only, "We continued moving to the extraction point. We traveled light." This episode is one of dozens, perhaps hundreds, that were never officially recorded. The Australian Army did not keep a record of prisoners who did not live until evacuation. American advisors, if present, received unambiguous signals that what was happening was none of their business. The question arises, should we condemn people who made a terrible but logical choice in inhuman conditions, or admit that war is a territory where civilian morality does not work? Australian veterans, with whom the author of these lines managed to speak on condition of anonymity, are unanimous in one thing. What they did was necessary for survival. Every prisoner is a risk. Every released enemy is a person who tomorrow might set an ambush for your comrades. In the jungle, there is no room for compassion. But SS officers said the same thing at the Nuremberg trials. The line between necessity and crime is thinner than we would like to think. Let's return to the warning about the backpacks. What exactly could have been in there that, _23 were better off not knowing about? A former sergeant of U.S. Army intelligence who served in Vietnam in 1967 to 68 said the following in a 2014 interview. He was invited to the Australian base at Nui Dat to coordinate intelligence activities. After the formal part, he was informally introduced to several SASR operators. One of the Australians, having had quite a drink, showed him the contents of his _24_. There were things there that the sergeant refused to describe in detail even nearly half a century later. He said only, _25. The practice of taking trophies from the bodies of killed enemies is as old as war itself. Indian scalps, ears in Vietnam. This is a confirmed practice that Americans were also guilty of, although officially it was strictly forbidden. But the Australians, according to the sergeant, elevated this to a system. Why? The answer lies in the realm of psychological warfare. The Viet Cong cadres were ideologically motivated. They were prepared to die for the cause of the revolution. Ordinary death in battle did not frighten them. It was honorable, expected, extolled in propaganda. But what the Australians did with the bodies was something else. It was desecration. It was a message in a language that all cultures understand. We don't just kill you. We destroy your memory, your honor, your afterlife. For people believing in ancestor worship, in the necessity of proper burial, in the link between the integrity of the body and the fate of the soul, this was a weapon of pure terror. And it worked. In intercepted Viet Cong documents, Phuc Tuy province was described as a zone to be avoided. Cadres were recommended not to operate there without extreme necessity. They feared the Australians in a way they feared no Americans, but this weapon had a price. People who practice such things change irreversibly. They cross a line from which there is no return to normal civilian life. Statistics on post-traumatic disorders among Australian SASR veterans are still classified, but indirect data speaks volumes. The suicide rate among Australian Vietnam veterans is one of the highest in the world. Alcoholism, broken families, inability to adapt to peaceful life. This is an epidemic about which Australian society prefers not to speak. People who were turned into perfect predators cannot simply switch off this mode upon returning home. The jungle stays with them forever. In 1971, Australian troops were withdrawn from Vietnam. The war ended for them, though for the Americans and Vietnamese it continued for another 4 years. The Australian government tried to forget this chapter of history as quickly as possible. There were no victory parades, because there was no victory. There was no public recognition of merit, because recognition would have required answers to uncomfortable questions. Veterans returned to a country that preferred to pretend nothing had happened. Many documents were classified for 50 years, some forever. Oral histories of veterans began to be collected only in the 90s when many participants had already passed away. And what of the Americans? Did they learn anything from their Australian allies? Officially, no. American military doctrine after Vietnam went in the direction of even greater technologization. Precision weapons, satellite reconnaissance, drones, everything that allows destroying the enemy without looking him in the eye, without dirtying hands, without suffering psychological trauma. Unofficially, yes. Training programs for U.S. Special Forces, especially after failures in Somalia and early operations in Afghanistan, began to include elements suspiciously similar to Australian methods. Small groups, long, autonomous operations, reliance on local guides, psychological impact on the enemy. Some historians believe that modern American elite units, DevGru, Delta Force, are closer in spirit to the Australian SASR of 1968 than to their own Green Berets of that time. If this is true, it means the lessons were learned, albeit 30 years late. But let us return to the main question. Why was the warning about the backpacks specifically a warning and not, say, a recommendation to study the Australian experience? The answer is that the American command wanted the Australians' results, but did not want to answer for their methods. It was politically impossible to officially endorse tactics that included things incompatible with the image of quote underscore 28 underscore that American propaganda cultivated throughout the war. American soldiers were supposed to bring democracy and freedom. They were not supposed to hunt people like animals and collect trophies from bodies. Therefore, the warning about the backpacks was a form of institutional hypocrisy. Quote 29. Half a century has passed. Vietnam has become history, which most Americans know from movies and books, rather than personal experience. Australian participation in that war is almost forgotten. A few hundred soldiers against the backdrop of a 500,000-strong American army, a statistical error in history textbooks. But in certain circles, among Special Forces veterans, among military historians, among those who study the art of war, the Australian SASR in Vietnam remains a legend. A dark legend about men who showed that war can be waged with monstrous efficiency if all limitations are cast aside. This legend does not fit into the usual categories of heroism. There are no noble knights saving the innocent. There are only predators and victims, hunters and prey. Perhaps this is what makes the story of the Australian SASR so compelling and so repulsive at the same time. It shows us the face of war without embellishment, without propaganda gloss, without comforting myths about quote 30 and quote 31. It was evil. Perhaps necessary, perhaps effective, but evil. And the people who committed it paid their price. Many, even before they returned home. Many, in the subsequent decades of nightmares, alcoholism, and loneliness. The warning about the backpacks was not just a briefing for new recruits. It was an admission that there are things better left unseen, not because they are classified, but because some knowledge destroys. The final question that remains unanswered. If Australian methods had been adopted by the American Army at scale, would it have changed the outcome of the war? Some military historians argue yes, that a guerrilla war can only be won by guerrilla methods, that thousands of small, deadly patrols scattered across Vietnam could have done what all of America's firepower could not. Others object. Scaling is impossible. Australian methods worked precisely because they were applied on a limited scale by select men, under conditions of minimal control. An attempt to reproduce them in a mass army would have inevitably led to catastrophe, uncontrolled atrocities, desertion, total decomposition of discipline. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle, but we will never know for sure. What we know for sure is that at a certain moment in history, in a certain place on Earth, a small group of men from a distant land showed the world what war looks like without rules. A war where the only morality is efficiency and the only goal is the survival of one's own and the destruction of others. These men returned home heroes to some and criminals to others. Most of them never spoke of what they did in the jungle. Many took their secrets to the grave. But the memory remained. In classified documents, in the oral traditions of the veteran community, in the warning that one officer passed to another in a Fort Bragg barracks many years ago. Don't look in their packs, and don't ask what's inside. Some doors are better left unopened, some questions are better left unasked, and some stories are better left where they belong, in the shadows on the border between the known and the unknown. This is one of those stories.